The streets of Memphis, Tennessee were quiet that night, save for the occasional hum of traffic lights flickering from red to green. A few late-night cars cruised past, their headlights slicing through the dim glow of street lamps. Andre Collins barely noticed. He had just wrapped up a dinner with colleagues, a rare evening where work didn't dominate the conversation. For once, he wasn't thinking about cases, courtrooms, or the relentless weight of justice. His mind was on something simpler. Home. The moment shattered with a flash of red and blue in his rearview mirror. Andre's jaw tightened. He wasn't speeding. He hadn't run a light. There was no reason for a stop. But deep down, he knew better than to assume reason had anything to do with it. He exhaled, signaling to pull over. His fingers reached for his wallet, muscle memory from years of knowing how these things could go wrong. Keep your hands visible, move slow, stay calm. A police cruiser rolled to a stop behind him, headlights flooding his car. Two silhouettes stepped out. Andre stole a glance at his side mirror. Officer Greg Langley, tall, broad, with a stiff military posture, approached the driver's side. His face was unreadable, but his steps were deliberate. Officer Sean Cooper, leaner but no less imposing, hovered near the passenger window, his hand resting casually on his belt. Something about their stance sent a chill through Andre's spine. Langley knocked on the window, short and sharp. License and registration. Andre complied, sliding his ID and registration into Langley's gloved hand. The officer barely looked at them before asking, "You know why I pulled you over?" Andre met his gaze. "No, officer, I don't." Langley glanced at Cooper, then back at Andre. "Your tail light's out." A lie. Andre knew his car had just passed inspection. He'd seen the reflection of his brake lights in the window of a gas station 15 minutes ago. His gut twisted, but he forced himself to keep his voice even. "Are you sure about that?" Langley's expression didn't change. "Step out of the vehicle." Andre's pulse spiked. This was escalating too fast. He wasn't reaching for anything. He hadn't raised his voice. He'd done everything right. And yet, they were already skipping ahead in their script. His lawyer's mind kicked in. "You don't have to step out unless there's probable cause. Ask why. Stay in control. I'd like to know why you're ordering me out of my car, officer." Cooper smirked, shifting his stance. "Because we said so." A slow dread curled in Andre's stomach. He had prosecuted cases just like this, where a routine stop turned into something far worse. And now he was living it. Andre's grip tightened around the steering wheel. He had done nothing wrong, but the moment he questioned them, he saw the shift in their eyes. They weren't here to have a conversation. Langley leaned in closer, his frame nearly filling the driver's side window. "Step out of the vehicle." "Now." Andre kept his voice measured. "Respectfully, officer. I know my rights." "You haven't given me a valid reason." Cooper scoffed from the other side. "You really gonna play lawyer with us, huh?" Andre's stomach churned. They were escalating, fast. Langley's patience snapped. He yanked the door open. Before Andre could react, Langley grabbed his wrist, pulling him forward. His seatbelt jerked against his chest, slamming him back into his seat. "What the hell are you doing?" Andre barked, his free hand instinctively pushing against the dashboard to brace himself. "Stop resisting." The words came too quickly, too rehearsed. Andre barely had time to process before Cooper yanked the seatbelt free, unlocking it from the buckle. In a flash, both officers had their hands on him, dragging him out of the car. Andre hit the pavement hard. His knees scraped against the rough asphalt as his body twisted under their grip. Click. Cold metal snapped around his wrist, handcuffs. His heart pounded, but it wasn't fear. It was rage. Lying face down on the ground, he felt the weight of Langley's knee pressing into his back. Andre clenched his jaw. This was a setup. A game. And they thought they had already won. Andrew Collins, Langley muttered, reading his ID. He let out a dry chuckle. Assistant U.S. Attorney, huh? Cooper smirked. Doesn't mean shit tonight. Andre closed his eyes, forcing himself to breathe. He knew how this worked. They were counting on him to panic, to react, to give them a real reason to charge him. Instead, he went still. That threw them off. Langley shifted his weight. Get him in the car. Cooper wrenched him up by the cuffs, pain searing through Andre's shoulders as he was hauled to his feet. The flashing lights of the squad car reflected off the wet pavement. Somewhere down the block, a few distant figures stopped to watch, their faces barely visible in the dim light. But no one moved. No one intervened. As they shoved him into the back seat, Andre's mind wasn't on the pain in his wrists or the sting of asphalt in his palms. It was on what came next. He wasn't just going to fight this, he was going to expose it. And he knew exactly where to start. The courtroom in Shelby County Courthouse buzzed with quiet activity. Clerks flipping through case files, attorneys whispering over paperwork, the dull hum of the ceiling fans filling the spaces between conversations. But beneath the routine, something heavier lingered. This wasn't just another case. Andre Collins sat at the defendant's table, his hands clasped together, jaws set. He wasn't here as a prosecutor today. He was the accused. He'd spent his career in courtrooms like this, but never on this side. The irony wasn't lost on him. Across the room, Judge Eleanor Grayson adjusted her glasses, her expression unreadable. Mid-60s, sharp-eyed and notoriously impatient, she had a reputation for zero tolerance and little sympathy. Andre had studied her rulings before. He knew what kind of judge she was, one who rarely ruled in favor of defendants like him. The prosecutor, Daniel Monroe, was already on his feet, smoothing down his tie, his confidence almost smug. Your Honor, this is a simple case, he began, turning toward the jury. The defendant escalated a routine traffic stop into a confrontation. He refused to comply with lawful orders and resisted arrest. Andre's lawyer, Malcolm Reed, a public defender who looked like he was juggling 10 cases at once, immediately stood up. Objection, Your Honor. There is no evidence my client was aggressive. Judge Grayson barely looked at him before waving her hand. Overruled. Andre clenched his jaw. That was fast. Monroe barely hid his smirk as he continued, flipping through his notes as if reading from a script. The officers in question, Langley and Cooper, are decorated members of this department. Their reports are clear. The defendant refused multiple commands to exit his vehicle. He became uncooperative, forcing officers to restrain him for their safety. Andre's fingers curled into fists under the table. Every word was a lie. He knew the truth didn't matter here, only what could be proven. Langley took the stand first. He adjusted his uniform, his voice steady, rehearsed. The defendant was immediately confrontational, he said smoothly. He raised his voice, refused to exit the vehicle, and tensed up when we attempted to escort him out. Andre fought the urge to laugh at the absurdity. Escort. They had ripped him out like he was a threat. Then Cooper took the stand, nodding along to everything Langley said. We feared for our safety. He was non-compliant, and we had no choice but to detain him. More lies. Andre exhaled slowly, keeping his composure. He had spent his career fighting against this kind of corruption, and now he was living it. Judge Grayson looked to his lawyer. Anything else, Mr. Reed? Reed hesitated. He knew this judge, knew her track record. But he swallowed hard and stood his ground. Yes, Your Honor. The defense calls Andre Collins to the stand. This was it. As Andre rose, all eyes locked onto him, because what was about to happen would change everything. Andre Collins rose from his seat, adjusting his suit jacket as he walked toward the witness stand. Every pair of eyes in the courtroom locked onto him. The prosecutor, Daniel Monroe, stood near the jury box, arms crossed, exuding confidence, as if he had already won. The moment Andre sat down, the court clerk swore him in. He placed his hands on his lap, his demeanor calm. But beneath the surface, he was simmering. Monroe wasted no time. "Mr. Collins," he began, pacing slightly, his voice smooth and measured. "Would you say you complied with the officer's instructions that night?" Andre met his gaze. "I asked why I was being ordered out of my car. That's not illegal." Monroe gave a performative sigh, shaking his head slightly as he turned to the jury. "But you refused to step out, correct?" Andre's voice remained steady. "I asked for a reason, which I have the legal right to do." Monroe smirked. "And after multiple lawful orders, you still didn't comply?" Andre didn't blink. "Because there was no lawful reason." A few members of the jury leaned forward. Monroe's confidence faltered just slightly. He turned toward Judge Grayson, hoping to regain control. Andre saw his opening, and he took it. He leaned forward just enough for his voice to carry across the silent room. "Before we go any further, I should probably disclose something." Monroe hesitated. Even Judge Grayson looked up, the first sign of interest she had shown all day. Andre reached into his briefcase. His lawyer, Malcolm Reed, tensed. He didn't know what was coming. Slowly, Andre pulled out his badge. A small, simple rectangle that, at this moment, had become the most dangerous thing in the courtroom. "I'm Andre Collins," he said, his voice slicing through the tension. "Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Western District." The courtroom froze. Judge Grayson's fingers tightened around her gavel. The stenographer stopped typing. The jury sat up straighter. The officers, Langley and Cooper, stiffened. Daniel Monroe's face lost all color. "Excuse me?" Monroe stammered. Andre tilted his head. "Did I stutter?" Silence hung in the air like a ticking bomb. For the first time, Monroe had no response. Judge Grayson exhaled, slow and measured, as if calculating her next move. She knew this case had just exploded beyond her control. Andre held his ground. Langley and Cooper wouldn't walk away from this unscathed. Not this time. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. Andre Collins sat still in the witness chair, his badge resting in his open palm, the official seal of the United States Department of Justice gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. No one moved. No one spoke. Judge Eleanor Grayson was the first to react. She adjusted her glasses, but the subtle tightening of her lips gave her away. She was calculating, assessing how deep this revelation had just cut. This wasn't just another case anymore. This was a ticking bomb. Daniel Monroe, the once confident prosecutor, was now visibly shaken. His fingers twitched against his legal pad, flipping through pages as if somewhere in his notes he'd find a way to undo what had just happened. He wouldn't. Andre turned to him, his voice calm, deliberate. "I believe this changes things, doesn't it?" Monroe swallowed hard. I wasn't aware of this information prior to today." Andre tilted his head. "That's interesting, considering I gave my full legal name upon arrest. Surely you ran it through the system?" A murmur rippled through the jury. They weren't just listening anymore. They were watching, analyzing, realizing. Judge Grayson exhaled sharply, finally regaining her composure. She turned toward Monroe. "Mr. Monroe, do you wish to continue questioning the witness?" Monroe's jaw clenched. He had no good options left. If he pushed forward, he risked exposing himself as complicit in a system that railroaded people without due process. If he backed off, he was conceding defeat. Langley and Cooper shifted uncomfortably at the defendant's table, their faces no longer smug, but tight with barely restrained panic. Andre watched them, his stare unwavering. They had played this game before, only this time they had picked the wrong person. Monroe cleared his throat, forcing a thin smile. "No further questions, Your Honor." The moment the words left his mouth, the energy in the courtroom shifted. It was subtle, but Andre recognized it. The foundation of their case had just cracked. Judge Grayson turned to Andre's defense attorney, Malcolm Reed. "Mr. Reed, do you wish to proceed?" Reed, who had barely masked his shock up until this point, nodded quickly. "Yes, Your Honor. The defense requests that the court pull the dispatch call logs from the night of my client's arrest." Monroe flinched. Andre smirked. He wasn't guessing. He knew. If those officers had radioed in before stopping him, the logs would show what they claimed. If they hadn't, it would prove they stopped him without cause. Judge Grayson hesitated. She knew what was at stake. Denying the request now meant burying evidence. Approving it meant this case wasn't just a local problem anymore. It was federal. Finally, she cleared her throat. Request granted. Langley exhaled sharply. Cooper's fingers curled into fists. Andre leaned back in his chair. Now it was only a matter of time. The courtroom was still buzzing when Andre Collins stepped outside, the sharp sting of cold air hitting his face. He barely had time to take a breath before the chaos erupted. Cameras, reporters, questions flying from every direction. "Mr. Collins, were you falsely arrested? Did the police know who you were? Do you believe this was racially motivated?" Andre didn't flinch. He had been in front of cameras before, but never like this. Never as the story. His lawyer, Malcolm Reed, put a firm hand on his shoulder. "No statements right now," he muttered. But it was already too late. Somewhere in the crowd, a young reporter from the Memphis Tribune had already posted the breaking news online. Within minutes, the headlines spread like wildfire. Federal prosecutor wrongfully arrested. Courtroom shaken as U.S. attorney exposes corrupt officers. By the time Andre got home, the story had exploded. Social media was flooded with clips from inside the courtroom. The moment Andre pulled out his badge, viral. Judge Grayson's stunned reaction, replayed on news segments. Monroe's face when he realized he lost. A meme within hours. But the fallout wasn't just online. The next morning, protests erupted outside the Shelby County Courthouse, signs with bold, furious words. "How many more? Justice for all, not just the powerful. Accountability now." Community leaders, civil rights attorneys, and activists took to the streets. People weren't just angry for Andre. They were angry for every person who had sat in that courtroom without a badge to save them. And then the real damage came. An anonymous leak surfaced. Internal police emails, dispatch logs, reports buried under red tape. They exposed a pattern of unlawful traffic stops, most of them targeting black drivers, some cases eerily similar to Andre's. But those people weren't federal prosecutors. They were ordinary citizens, and many of them had pled guilty just to avoid jail time. Now their cases were being re-examined. The Shelby County Police Department scrambled for damage control. They released a carefully worded statement, promising a full internal review. No one bought it. By the end of the week, the Tennessee Attorney General's office announced a formal investigation into the department. Judge Grayson's past rulings were suddenly under scrutiny. Daniel Monroe's prosecutorial history was being picked apart. Andre sat in his apartment, his phone vibrating non-stop. Calls from journalists, lawyers, people who had been through what he had, but never had the platform to fight back. This wasn't just about him anymore. And the system knew it. The air inside the Shelby County Courthouse was heavy with anticipation. Andre Collins sat at the defense table, his face calm, but his mind was sharp. This wasn't just about his case anymore. It was about every name that had never made it to the headlines. Judge Eleanor Grayson adjusted her glasses, her expression unreadable. But Andre could see the weight on her shoulders. She wasn't just delivering a verdict. She was deciding whether to protect the system or let it crumble. She cleared her throat, the gavel resting lightly in her grip. After reviewing the evidence, the court finds the defendant. She hesitated. The room held its breath. Then, "Not guilty." A ripple of shock spread through the courtroom. It wasn't just relief. It was disbelief. For once, the system didn't win. But Judge Grayson wasn't finished. She turned to the prosecution table, her gaze locking onto Daniel Monroe. Her voice was firm, controlled. "Furthermore, this court is forwarding all relevant materials to the Tennessee Attorney General's office for further investigation." Andrew's pulse remained steady, but he saw it. The flash of panic in Monroe's eyes, the barely concealed fear in Langley and Cooper sitting stiffly at the defendant's table. This wasn't over for them. The murmurs grew louder. Reporters scribbled furiously. The court clerk's fingers flew over the stenotype machine. Monroe straightened, forcing his usual confidence back into place. "Your Honor, if I may." She held up her hand, silencing him. "You may not." That was it. For the first time, the system had turned its gaze back on itself. Andre stood slowly as Malcolm Reed patted his back. He turned, scanning the faces in the room. Not just the officers. Not just Monroe, but the people in the gallery. Community leaders, activists, ordinary people who had come just to see if justice was even possible. Outside the courthouse, the crowd was waiting. As Andre stepped into the cold air, the roar of voices met him. Some were cheering, some were chanting, others just watched, their expressions unreadable. His phone buzzed again. Journalists, lawyers, people who had sat in that same courtroom before him, but had never walked out free. This wasn't a victory. It was proof. Proof that what had always been happening was real, that the system only bent when it had no other choice, that justice wasn't about fairness. It was about power. And now, with the world watching, that power was shifting. This wasn't just a courtroom battle. It wasn't just about one man proving his innocence. It was about the system. How many others had sat in Andre's seat, accused of crimes they never committed? How many had been silenced because they lacked the badge, the title, or the platform to fight back? This case proved one thing: justice isn't guaranteed, it's demanded. It took a viral moment, national outrage, and relentless public pressure to force the system to acknowledge the truth. But what about those who don't have the cameras, the reporters, or the public watching? That's where we come in. Speak up, call it out, demand accountability. Share this story, make sure no one forgets it. Stay informed, because knowledge is power. If you believe in holding the system accountable, in amplifying voices that are often ignored, then hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. This isn't just a story. This is a movement. Are you watching? Because now they know we are.